The helicopters never landed. That was the first rule of Operation Iron Shroud, and in special operations, the first rule is the one that keeps you alive. The four MH-60 Black Hawks came in low over the Kunar province ridgeline, flying without lights, without radio transmission, without any electronic signature that an enemy scanner could grab and trace. They hovered just long enough for the men inside to drop into the darkness below, then tilted nose forward and disappeared back into the Afghan night like ghosts, returning to whatever world ghosts come from. 480 Navy SEALs hit the frozen ground in complete silence. No lights, no whispers, no confirmation calls between team leaders. Every man had memorized his role so completely that language was no longer necessary. They moved like water finding its level, naturally, inevitably, without waste. Within 4 minutes of the last boot touching Afghan soil, the teams were formed, oriented, and moving southeast toward the mountains. The date was November 3, 2009. The temperature at that altitude was 11 degrees Fahrenheit. The nearest American base was 47 miles away. The nearest record of this mission existing anywhere in any official system was nowhere. Operation Iron Shroud did not exist. The men conducting it for the duration of what followed did not exist. If something went wrong inside those mountains, the machinery of the United States military would not come. There was no contingency. There was no rescue protocol. There was only the mission and the men and the darkness. Their target had taken 3 years to locate. Deep inside the mountain network of eastern Kunar, a region so hostile that even seasoned Afghan army units refused extended operations there, the Taliban had constructed something that American intelligence analysts had spent the better part of a decade trying to understand. It wasn't a single base. It was a nervous system. A command and communication network built into the natural cave architecture of the mountains, reinforced over years, supplied through routes that moved only at night and only in small enough quantities to avoid satellite detection. The network coordinated attacks across 4 provinces. It had orchestrated the deaths of 31 American service members in the preceding 18 months alone. 3 previous attempts to dismantle it had failed, 2 from insufficient intelligence, 1 from a leak that the DoD had never fully traced and preferred not to discuss. Iron Shroud was the 4th attempt. It was also the last one anyone was willing to authorize. The plan was brutally simple in concept, brutally complex in execution. 3 SEAL strike teams would infiltrate from 3 separate approach vectors, converge on the primary network hub simultaneously, destroy the command infrastructure, extract through a single egress route to the southeast, and be wheels up before Taliban forces in the region could mount a coordinated response. The entire operation was planned for a 72-hour window. Every hour beyond that increased the risk of exposure exponentially. What made Iron Shroud different from the 3 failed attempts before it was not firepower? It was information. Specifically, a single source, identity classified above top secret, who had provided targeting data so precise and so detailed that the analysts who reviewed it reportedly spent 2 days looking for the fabrication before concluding it was real. Nobody told the SEALs where that information came from. In special operations, you learn not to ask questions that will either go unanswered or be answered in ways you'll wish they hadn't been. Moving with the lead strike element, Call Sign Hammer 1, was a figure listed on the team manifest under the designation Medic Contract, Sarah Cole. She had been attached to the unit 72 hours before deployment through a set of orders that cleared every administrative checkpoint with remarkable smoothness. The kind of smoothness that, to anyone paying close attention, suggested the orders had been written by someone who knew exactly which checkpoints existed and exactly how to clear them. She was tall, lean, and moved with an economy of motion that experienced operators notice immediately and instinctively respect. Her gear was non-standard in several small but significant ways. The medical pack on her back was custom configured in a layout that no field medic training program in the United States military formally teaches, which meant she had either designed it herself through years of hard experience, or someone had designed it for her based on a very detailed operational profile. She hadn't said more than 11 words since the mission briefing at Bagram Air Base. During the briefing itself, she had sat in the back row, asked no questions and taken no notes. When the commanding officer finished and asked if there were any concerns, every head in the room turned slightly, the involuntary way people turn when they sense a presence, toward the back corner where she sat. She said nothing. She simply looked at the map on the wall with an expression that suggested she had already found 3 things the briefing officer had missed and was deciding whether it was worth mentioning them. The SEALs left her alone. In special operations culture, the people who speak the least in the briefing room are almost always the ones who perform the most in the field. Quiet people in that world are not shy. They are conserving something. As the teams moved through the first valley in the black Afghan night, Senior Chief Ray Domings, a 17-year SEAL veteran who had operated in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and Somalia, fell into step near Sarah Cole for a stretch of trail too narrow to avoid proximity. He studied her movement from the corner of his eye, the way she placed her feet, the way her head moved, not scanning nervously, but turning in slow, deliberate arcs, reading the terrain the way a person reads a familiar book. He had seen that kind of movement before, not in medics, not in contractors, in operators who had spent years in terrain exactly like this. He filed the observation away and said nothing. Above them, the mountains of Kunar rose black and enormous against a sky thick with stars. Beautiful in the way that genuinely dangerous things are sometimes beautiful, completely indifferent to the smallness of the men moving through them. Somewhere inside those mountains, the target waited. Somewhere inside those mountains, something else waited too, something that no intelligence briefing had anticipated, no analyst had modeled, and no commanding officer had planned for. The column moved in silence. Sarah Cole walked near the front, her eyes moving across the ridgelines above with the patient, unhurried attention of someone who already knew that the mountains were watching back. She had been here before. Not on this mission, not under this name. But here, in this country, in this darkness, in this particular quality of silence that falls over a landscape just before it decides to kill you. She knew what was coming. She always did. Birds don't lie. That is something every soldier who has spent real time in real combat learns eventually. Not in a classroom, not in a briefing, but in the field, usually once, usually the hard way. Animals don't have agendas. They don't posture. They don't set traps or run psychological operations. When something frightens them badly enough to silence them, it is because something genuinely worth fearing is very close. Senior Chief Ray Domings heard it first. Or rather, he heard the absence of it. The valley they were moving through had been alive with sound for the past 2 hours. Night insects, the distant movement of wind through rock formations, the occasional shifting of loose stones somewhere above. Background noise that a civilian would find menacing and a soldier learns to find reassuring, because background noise means nothing extraordinary is happening. Then, without transition, it stopped. Every sound, simultaneously. Domings raised his right fist. The entire column, 480 men moving through darkness across a half-kilometer of terrain, froze within 3 seconds. Not a sound, not a shifted boot, not a cough suppressed too slowly. Just stillness, the kind that only highly trained men can produce on command, the kind that feels almost unnatural because it is. 3 seconds passed. Then 5. Then the mountain opened fire. The first RPG came from the left ridge, a streak of orange light that covered the distance between the launch point and the front of the column, so fast that the sound of the launch arrived after the explosion. The blast threw 2 SEALs off their feet and opened a crater in the trail that hadn't existed a heartbeat before. Before the dust from the first impact had reached chest height, machine gun positions opened up from 3 directions: left ridge, right ridge, and a forward position that had been dug into the rock face directly ahead, invisible until the muzzle flashes gave it away. This was not a chance contact. Chance contacts are messy. They're disorganized. They're two forces surprising each other and both scrambling to recover. This was something else entirely. The firing positions were pre-sighted. The kill zone had been constructed in advance. The timing, hitting all 3 elements of the column simultaneously, required coordination, communication, and foreknowledge of exactly where the SEALs would be, at exactly what time, moving in exactly what formation. Someone had talked. That thought moved through every senior operator in the column at the same moment, but there was no time for it now. 3 SEALs were down in the first 60 seconds. Petty Officer First Class Daniel Marsh, 29 years old, father of 2 daughters in Pensacola, Florida, took a round through the upper right chest and dropped without a sound. Petty Officer Second Class Eric Havorson went down with shrapnel through his left leg, conscious but unable to move. A third operator, whose name would remain classified in every subsequent report, took a grazing round to the skull that rendered him immediately unconscious. The column broke into fire teams and found cover with the practiced urgency of men who had trained for exactly this. But training and reality are separated by a distance that can only be crossed by actually surviving the real thing. Sarah Cole crossed it without hesitation. She was moving before most men had fully registered what was happening. Not running. Running is panic, and panic gets you killed. She moved low and fast in a controlled diagonal sprint that took her through a gap in the incoming fire with a precision that suggested she had read the firing positions, calculated the beaten zones, and identified the safest line of movement in approximately the same time it takes most people to blink. She reached Marsh first. He was on his back, conscious but losing ground fast. A sucking chest wound, the kind that kills men not from blood loss but from the lung collapsing under pressure that has nowhere to go. Every combat medic knows the sound. It is unmistakable, and it means the clock is already running. Sarah Cole didn't fumble. She didn't check her pack or hesitate over options. She rolled Marsh onto his side with one motion, located the entry wound with 2 fingers in the darkness, no light, no visibility, pure tactile knowledge, and had a chest seal pressed and locked over the wound in under 18 seconds. She was already moving toward Havorson before Marsh drew his next breath. A SEAL named Corporal James Torres was pinned behind a boulder 4 meters away, laying down suppressive fire on the right ridge. He could not have moved from that position without exposing himself to a machine gun that had already found its range. But he could see her, and what he saw made him stop firing for exactly 2 seconds, an eternity in a firefight, because his brain simply could not immediately reconcile what his eyes were showing him. She moved through that kill zone like she owned it. Not recklessly, not with the wild abandon of someone who doesn't understand the danger, with the calm, deliberate confidence of someone who understands the danger completely and has made a decision about it. She knew where the rounds were going. She knew the rhythm of the fire, when the gunners were acquiring, when they were tracking, when they were reloading. She moved in the spaces between those moments like she had memorized a pattern that no one else could see. Torres would tell investigators months later, in a classified deposition that he did not know would eventually reach a congressional subcommittee. I have been in 11 combat deployments across 3 theaters. I have served alongside some of the finest special operators this country has ever produced. I have never not once seen a human being move the way she moved in that kill zone. It wasn't bravery. Bravery is being scared and going anyway. She didn't look scared. She looked like she was exactly where she expected to be, doing exactly what she had always known she would have to do. By the time the initial contact had been running for 4 minutes, Sarah Cole had treated 3 critical casualties, administered 2 tourniquet applications, and repositioned herself to the forward edge of the defensive perimeter, where she could assess the full scope of the situation. She knelt behind a rock shelf, looked across the kill zone with steady eyes, and did something that no one around her was doing in that moment. She was counting muzzle flashes, not reacting to them, counting them, mapping positions, building a picture in her head of something that the Taliban commanders on those ridges believed was invisible in the darkness and chaos of their carefully constructed ambush. Senior Chief Domings crawled to her position through a stretch of ground that cost him the skin on both elbows. He pulled up beside her, breathing hard, and looked at her face. She wasn't breathing hard. "What are you seeing?" he demanded. She didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed on the ridgeline. 14 positions, she said. They expected us to break right. They weighted the left side heavier because the right ridge offers natural cover, and they wanted to funnel us into the open ground to the north. She paused. "Don't go north." Doming stared at her. "How do you know that?" She finally looked at him. In the brief flash of a distant explosion, he saw her face clearly for the first time since they'd left Bagram. She looked completely, unnervingly calm. "Because," she said quietly, "it's what I would have done. First sunrise over Kunar province was beautiful. Nobody noticed. When you are pinned inside a 2-kilometer kill zone with no air support, no working communications, and an enemy that has had 3 days to prepare the ground you are standing on, beauty becomes a concept that belongs to a different world entirely. The world of people who slept in beds last night, who will eat breakfast this morning, who have no idea that 480 men are currently deciding, hour by hour, whether they are going to live or die in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan." The SEALs consolidated through the night into 3 defensive clusters, using the natural terrain, boulders, shallow ravines, the collapsed remains of an ancient stone structure that no one could identify, as cover. They were fragmented but not broken, disorganized but not panicked. These were men who had been selected, trained, and tested specifically for moments like this one, and the training held even when everything else had stopped working. What hadn't held was the communications equipment. The Taliban jamming array, sophisticated, American-adjacent in its design, obtained through channels that would later trigger a separate classified investigation, was blanketing the entire valley in a frequency wash that reduced every radio in the column to static. Satellite uplink attempts failed. Emergency beacon signals went out and came back with no acknowledgement. For all practical purposes, the most powerful military force in human history had no idea that 480 of its best men were trapped in a mountain valley with no way to call for help. The extraction window was 61 hours away. Sarah Cole did the math before anyone asked her to, and she did not share the full calculation with anyone. What she shared was the part that was useful. They had enough medical supplies, if managed with absolute precision, to sustain the current casualty load for approximately 54 hours. What she kept to herself was the second part of that calculation, the part that accounted for the casualties that hadn't happened yet but would, because the Taliban was not going to wait politely while the SEALs organized themselves. She began by taking full inventory of every medical asset in the column. She moved from position to position in the early morning light, staying low, reading the terrain before each movement, never using the same path twice, and collected information with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had done this many times before under conditions just as bad as these. She cataloged every trauma kit, every tourniquet, every unit of blood expander, every dose of morphine, every needle decompression kit. She built a supply map in her head so complete and precise that she could have recited the location and quantity of every critical item across a 2-kilometer defensive perimeter from memory. Then she started rationing. This was where men first began to understand that Sarah Cole was something different from what they had been told she was. A contract medic, even an exceptional one, treats casualties as they arrive and manages supplies reactively. What Sarah Cole was doing was something else. She was managing the battlefield's medical future before it happened. She was predicting where the next casualties would come from based on the Taliban's firing patterns, prepositioning supplies accordingly, and making cold-blooded decisions about allocation that required a strategic understanding of the overall tactical situation that went well beyond any medic's traditional role. She pulled a senior SEAL named Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb aside on the first morning and told him, without softening it, "You have 3 men who will not make it to extraction if they receive standard treatment. I can keep all 3 alive, but I need you to understand that the way I do it is going to look wrong to everyone watching. I need you to make sure no one interferes." Webb looked at her for a long moment. He was 38 years old, had served in 4 wars across 3 decades, and considered himself a man who was not easily unsettled. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "Whatever it takes," she said simply. He nodded. "Do it." What followed over the next 61 hours was something that the men who witnessed it would struggle for years to describe accurately. Not because their memories were unclear, but because the reality of what they saw consistently exceeded what they believed a single human being was capable of. On the first afternoon, with Taliban forces probing the eastern perimeter, Sarah Cole performed a field amputation. The patient was Petty Officer Second Class Thomas Kowalski, 26 years old, Warsaw-born, American citizen for 4 years, SEAL for 2. A secondary explosion had driven fragmented rock through his lower left leg with enough force to destroy the bone structure beyond any field repair. The wound was tourniqueted, but the tissue damage was progressing in a direction that Sarah Cole recognized immediately, and that left exactly one option. She did it by firelight, in a shallow depression screened from direct fire by 2 boulders and a piece of canvas someone had stretched between them. She used a surgical blade, a bone saw from her custom medical pack, an item that standard field medic kits do not contain, and a morphine dose she measured by Kowalski's body weight, his current blood pressure, and her estimate of his pain tolerance, all calculated without instruments. Kowalski was conscious through most of it. He didn't scream. Sarah Cole had told him before she began exactly what she was going to do, exactly what it would feel like, and exactly why it was the only way he was going home to his mother in Krakow. She spoke to him in a low, steady voice throughout the procedure, not comforting platitudes, but real information, real updates. "I'm at the midpoint. You're doing well. Your pressure is holding. Stay with me." Treating him not as a patient to be managed, but as a person who deserved to know what was happening to his own body. When it was finished, she dressed the wound with a precision that a surgical theater nurse would have recognized, administered a secondary antibiotic dose from a supply she had been guarding since the first hour of the siege, and sat back on her heels. Kowalski looked up at her through the morphine and the exhaustion and the particular clarity that extreme pain sometimes produces and said, "Am I going to make it?" She looked at him directly. "Yes," she said, "but you're going to have to work for it." He almost smiled. "Yes, ma'am." On the second day, a SEAL named Petty Officer Aaron Stiles took a round through the forearm that severed the radial artery. He was losing blood at a rate that standard tourniquet application alone would not adequately control given the wound geometry. Sarah Cole controlled it with a technique that the military's own surgical manual would not formally document for another 3 years. A pressure packing method that she executed with the muscle memory of someone who had used it many times before. Stiles survived. He still has the arm. By the second night, something had shifted in the way the SEALs looked at her. It wasn't gratitude exactly. Gratitude is what you feel towards someone who has done something unexpectedly kind. What the men felt towards Sarah Cole was closer to something they had no clean word for. It was the feeling of being in the presence of someone who is operating at a level of competence so far beyond normal that it stops being reassuring and starts being slightly unnerving. Master Chief William Greer found her alone during a quiet stretch of the second night, sitting apart from the main defensive position, looking out at the dark ridgelines with those steady, patient eyes. "You need to sleep," he told her. "So do you," she said. "Go ahead, I'll watch the north approach." "That's not your job." She turned and looked at him with an expression he couldn't read. "Master Chief," she said quietly, "I've been doing this job for a very long time, longer than you know. And I can tell you with complete certainty that right now, at this hour, with what's coming tomorrow, the most important thing I can do for every man in this position is stay awake and watch the north approach." Greer studied her face in the darkness. "What's coming tomorrow?" he asked. She was already looking back at the ridgeline. "Everything," she said. She was right about everything. That was the part that stayed with Master Chief William Greer long after the mountains of Cunnar had become a memory he carried in his chest like a piece of shrapnel that the surgeons decided was safer to leave in than to cut out. In the years that followed, in the quiet hours of ordinary life that felt almost fraudulent after what he had survived, he would return again and again to that second night, to the moment she looked at the ridgeline and said everything, and understand, with the particular clarity that only hindsight provides, that she had not been speaking generally. She had known specifically what was coming. She had known because she had been reading the Taliban's operational pattern for 60 hours with the focused intensity of someone fluent in a language that most soldiers spend entire careers trying to learn. The probing attacks, the shift in firing positions, the way the flanking pressure had gradually, almost imperceptibly, been migrating southward, not randomly, but deliberately, like a hand slowly guiding something toward a predetermined point. They were being herded. On the morning of the third day, it became impossible to ignore. Taliban reinforcements had arrived overnight, fresh fighters visible on the northern ridge, in numbers that the SEALs' remaining optics could partially count and entirely dread. A forward observer reported vehicle movement on the eastern approach road 2 kilometers out. The jamming array was still holding. The extraction window was 9 hours away, 9 hours that suddenly felt like a geography as impossible as the mountains themselves. Sarah Cole called the senior operators together in a shallow depression that offered partial cover from 3 directions. She knelt in the dirt and drew with her finger, a map emerging from the ground itself, ridge lines and approach vectors, and the narrow southeastern pass that represented the only viable exit route for 480 men and their wounded. She drew it from memory, every line precise, every distance accurate. Nobody asked how she knew. "The extraction window opens in 9 hours, she said, her voice carrying the flat, informational quality of someone delivering a weather report. "The egress route runs through this pass." She traced the southeastern corridor. "It is currently accessible. In approximately 4 hours, based on the rate of their eastern repositioning, it will not be." The senior operators studied the dirt map in silence. "There is one elevated position that controls the entire pass approach," she continued. Her finger stopped on the eastern ridge, a natural rock formation that rose above the pass like a watchtower built by the mountains themselves. "Whoever holds that position controls whether 480 men walk out of this valley or die in it." The silence that followed had weight to it. Master Chief Greer looked at the ridge. He had already done the calculation, the same one every senior man in that circle had done the moment her finger stopped moving. To reach the pass, the teams needed a minimum of 40 minutes of uncontested movement. The eastern ridge would need to be held for that entire window. The position was isolated, exposed, and once the Taliban understood what was happening, it would receive everything they had. "We'll need a 4-man team minimum," Greer said. "Maybe 6. "No," Sarah Cole said. Everyone looked at her. A team makes noise moving into position. A team draws attention before the main element starts moving. A team creates a signature that tells them exactly what you're doing and gives them time to redirect." She paused. "One person can reach that position without being seen. One person can hold it long enough." One person cannot hold that ridge for 40 minutes against what they're going to throw at it, Greer said. His voice was controlled, but his jaw was tight. One person with the right preparation and the right positioning can hold it long enough for the last man to clear the pass, she replied. After that, it doesn't matter. The meaning of those last 4 words settled over the group like a cold wind coming down from the peaks above. After that, it doesn't matter. She wasn't talking about tactical flexibility. She wasn't leaving room for extraction or relief. She was describing, with complete and deliberate clarity, a one-way calculation, the kind that military planners put into doctrine under phrases like acceptable sacrifice, language designed to make the unbearable sound administrative. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb spoke first. "We're not leaving anyone on that ridge." "You already are," she said quietly. "The question is whether it's one person who chooses it or 6 people who don't." Nobody had an answer for that, because it wasn't a rhetorical point. It was mathematics, and the mathematics were correct, and everyone in that circle knew it and hated knowing it with the particular fury of people confronting a truth they cannot argue with. Sarah Cole stood up. She had already decided. The decision had been made if Greer had understood what he was seeing, somewhere around the second night, maybe earlier. Maybe before they left Bagram. Maybe in some way that he would spend years turning over in his mind, before any of them had ever heard of Operation Iron Shroud. She picked up both rifles. She checked them with the brisk, unhurried efficiency of someone performing a routine task. She took 2 additional magazines from a SEAL who offered them without being asked, nodded once in acknowledgement, and slung her medical bag over her left shoulder, a gesture that several men later described as the detail that hit them hardest, because the medical bag was useless where she was going and she knew it, and she took it anyway, perhaps because it was the truest expression of what she was. She was a person who carried the tools to keep people alive, even when she was walking toward a place where no one was going to keep her alive. Greer stepped in front of her. He was 6 feet 2 inches tall, 220 pounds, and had faced situations in his career that most human beings cannot conceptualize. He was not a man who was easily moved, but something in his face in that moment, witnessed by 11 men who would each describe it independently in subsequent years, was as close to undone as any of them had ever seen him. "There has to be another way," he said. She looked up at him, not defiantly, not with the performed courage of someone trying to seem braver than they feel, with the quiet, settled steadiness of someone who has already completed the internal journey that most people never have to make, the journey from "I don't want to die" to "I understand what this costs and I am paying it." "Get your men moving the moment I reach that ridge," she said. "Don't wait for a signal, don't stop for any reason, don't look back." A pause, "and don't come back for me." She stepped around him. Several men reached out, a hand on a shoulder, a grip on an arm, instinctive, human, the physical language of people who cannot find words for what they want to say. She moved through it gently but without stopping. She had said everything that needed to be said. At the edge of the depression, she paused once. Not to look back, she didn't look back. She paused the way a person pauses at a threshold, marking the moment, acknowledging in some private internal way the precise point at which one thing ends and another begins. Then she moved toward the ridge. The SEALs watched her go until the terrain swallowed her. Then Greer turned to the group, and his voice was steady because it had to be, because 480 men needed it to be, because that is what leadership costs sometimes. "Move," he said. They moved. For the next 44 minutes, the sounds from the eastern ridge were continuous and ferocious, a firefight of an intensity that told its own story about what one person was holding back. The SEALs moved through the pass below with their wounded, their exhausted, their grief already forming before it had an object, listening to the battle above them and moving faster because of it. The last man cleared the pass. Above them, the eastern ridge went silent. Not gradually, not winding down. Silent, the way things go silent when they are finished completely and absolutely and without remainder. Master Chief William Greer stood at the far end of the pass and looked back at the ridge for a long moment. Around him, 479 other men were still moving, following orders, doing what they had been told. But for those few seconds, Greer stood still. He didn't speak. There was nothing to say that the silence hadn't already said better. The recovery team left before sunrise. 4 men, lightly equipped, moving under a ceasefire window that had been negotiated through back channels so obscure that even the team leader, Staff Sergeant Aaron Phillips, a combat medic with 12 years of service and 3 combat deployments, had not been told who had negotiated it or with whom. He had been told only that he had a 90-minute window, that it would not be extended under any circumstances, and that he was to recover remains from the eastern ridge and return before the window closed. The word remains had been used deliberately. Nobody expected to find anything else. The approach to the eastern ridge took 34 minutes on foot, a climb through loose shale and frozen ground that the darkness made treacherous in ways that had nothing to do with enemy contact. The Taliban had withdrawn from the area, as the ceasefire required, but withdrawal in those mountains is a relative concept. Phillips kept his team moving fast and quiet, one eye on the terrain and one eye on the time, the way you move through a space that has temporarily stopped trying to kill you but hasn't forgotten how. They found her 40 meters below the ridge crest. She was propped against a boulder, not lying flat the way the dead lie, but sitting upright with her back against the rock, as if she had chosen the position deliberately, as if even at the end she had refused to go down. Her eyes were closed. Her breathing, when Phillips dropped to his knees beside her and pressed 2 fingers to her neck, was shallow and irregular but unmistakably present. She was alive. The word left Phillips' mouth before he could organize it into a sentence. She's alive. Just those 2 words, spoken to no one in particular, in a tone that contained equal parts professional relief and something much less professional, the raw, unguarded shock of a man whose expectations have been overturned so completely that his composure needs a moment to catch up. His team moved immediately. This was what they were trained for: stabilize, assess, prepare for transport. Phillips began the primary survey while his partner, Specialist Kevin Doran, established an IV line with the practice speed of someone who has done it in worse conditions than these. 2 gunshot wounds to the torso, entry and exit wounds consistent with 7.62 rounds, which meant K-pattern weapons, which meant she had been hit by the people she was holding back. A 3rd wound through the left thigh, the bone intact but the muscle damage significant. Blood loss substantial but not, by some calculation that defied easy explanation, fatal. Around her, the story of the previous night was written in the dirt and rock with a clarity that needed no interpretation. 23 dead Taliban fighters in a radius of roughly 60 meters. Spent casings from 2 different rifle platforms. Both weapons lay beside her, both empty. Both field cleared in the methodical way you clear a weapon when you intend to use it again before acknowledging that you cannot. A 3rd weapon, a Makarov pistol, not standard American issue, origin unknown, empty, slide locked back. A combat knife, blade dark, driven point first into the ground beside her right hand in the particular way that a person plants a blade when their hands are shaking too badly to sheath it properly. She had fought until there was nothing left to fight with. And then she had sat down, put her back against a boulder, and waited with whatever was left of her for whatever came next. Phillips dressed the wounds with the focused efficiency of a man working against a clock, but his mind was doing something else simultaneously. The involuntary, parallel processing of a trained observer cataloging details that didn't fit the picture he had been given. The gear she was wearing was non-standard in ways that went beyond the custom medical pack. The pistol was not American military issue. The way her remaining ammunition had been distributed across her person, not in standard pouches but in specific, immediately accessible locations, reflected a loadout philosophy that Phillips associated not with medics, but with long-range reconnaissance operators. People who operated alone. People who operated for a very long time in places where resupply was not an option. Standard protocol required identification before transport. Phillips knew this. In the field, in a situation like this, the protocol existed for reasons that were simultaneously bureaucratic and deeply human. The military's acknowledgement that even in chaos, even in the worst circumstances imaginable, a person deserves to be known, to be named, to have their existence confirmed by something more permanent than memory. He reached for her outer tactical vest to access the standard ID tag location at the collar. The vest was damaged, partially shredded by the same fragmentation event that had likely contributed to one of the torso wounds. He worked carefully, cutting away the compromised sections, and beneath the outer vest found a second layer, a thin plate carrier worn underneath, non-standard, the kind of additional protection that someone adds when they have personal experience of what happens when standard protection isn't enough. He cut through the plate carrier's shoulder strap and found the dog tags. He lifted them and held them close enough to read in the pre-dawn light. He read the name. He read it again. He held very still for a moment in a way that Doran noticed and would later describe as the way someone goes still when they've seen something they don't know how to process. Not scared, just suddenly very careful, like they're handling something fragile. Philip set the tags down gently against her chest and reached for his field tablet. Biometric identification was routine, fingerprints taken during medical treatment, run through the DoD database, cross-referenced with service records for confirmation and next-of-kin notification preparation. He had done it dozens of times. It was paperwork. It was the part of the job that felt administrative even in the field, the part that reminded you that behind all of this, behind the mountains and the darkness and the violence, there was a system, a record, a bureaucracy that was trying in its imperfect way to keep track of every person it sent into danger. He pressed her right index finger to the scanner. He waited the standard 12 seconds. The result came back in 4. The screen populated with the beginning of a file, name, rank, service number, a photograph. And then, before Phillips could read more than the first line, something happened that he had never seen in 12 years of service. The file collapsed. The screen went dark for 1 second. Then it returned, blank except for a single banner across the center, red, bordered, the kind of visual formatting that the DoD reserves for classifications so high that most people working within the system will complete entire careers without encountering them. The banner read, "Access restricted, notify JSOC command immediately. Do not transport without authorization, Protocol Wraith." Below it, a single instruction repeated 3 times in descending text. Cease all documentation, cease all documentation, cease all documentation. Philip stared at the screen. Doran leaned over his shoulder, read it, and said nothing. The other 2 team members exchanged a look that communicated everything neither of them was going to say out loud. The ceasefire window had 31 minutes remaining. Aaron Phillips sat back on his heels in the dirt of the eastern ridge, in the gray pre-dawn light of a morning that felt like it belonged to a different world than the night that had preceded it, and looked at the woman breathing slowly on the litter beside him. He looked at the locked screen. He looked at the dog tags resting against her chest. He looked at the 23 dead men arranged by violence across the ground around them. He sat in silence for 4 full minutes. Later, much later, in a closed room before people with no-name badges who asked very precise questions in very measured tones, he would be asked what he was thinking during those 4 minutes. He considered the question for a long time before answering. "I was thinking," he said finally, "that whatever she did to earn a banner like that, whatever she was, whoever she really was, she had just held a ridge alone for 44 minutes so that 480 men could go home to their families. And the first thing the system wanted me to do when I found her alive was stop writing it down." He paused. "I didn't think that was right," he said. "I still don't. There is a particular kind of silence that exists inside classified files. It is not the silence of absence, not the silence of a page that has nothing written on it. It is the silence of a page that has everything written on it and has been deliberately, carefully, surgically emptied. The silence of redaction. The silence of a system that has decided, at some level above accountability, that certain truths are too inconvenient, too dangerous, or too revealing to exist in any form that a curious person might one day find. The file on Lieutenant Commander Ilara Voss was that kind of silence. What remained of it, the fragments that survived in disconnected corners of systems that the Wraith program's architects had not fully anticipated when they built their architecture of erasure, told a story in pieces. A photograph here, a training record there, a single line in a Naval Academy graduation registry that listed her name, her hometown, and her class rank without elaboration. Pieces of a person, scattered across a bureaucracy like fragments of a photograph that someone had torn up and distributed across different rooms of a very large building. To understand who Ilara Voss really was, you had to find all the rooms. She was born in Billings, Montana, in the winter of 1976, the second of 3 children. Her father was a former Marine who ran a hardware store and coached youth wrestling on Thursday evenings. Her mother was a registered nurse who worked the overnight shift at the county hospital for 22 years without complaint and without recognition. The house she grew up in was small, heated by a wood stove in winter, and filled with the particular combination of discipline and warmth that comes from parents who have known hard things and decided that knowing hard things is not a reason to be unkind. She was not the kind of child who announces herself loudly to the world. She was the kind who watches, absorbs, and understands things 2 steps before anyone else in the room. Her teachers remembered her as quiet and precise, the student who already knew the answer before you finished asking the question. As one elementary school instructor wrote in an evaluation that somehow survived in a county education archive long after everything else about her had been classified away. She played no team sports. She ran, alone, early in the morning, on routes through the Montana hills that got longer every season as if she were training for a distance she hadn't yet been told about. She applied to the United States Naval Academy at 17. She was accepted. She arrived in Annapolis in the fall of 1994 and graduated 4 years later ranked second in her class. Second, not first. A detail that her instructors noted was not the result of any academic deficiency, but of a deliberate choice. She had, on at least 2 documented occasions, declined opportunities to demonstrate knowledge that would have elevated her ranking, as if she had already understood something about the value of not being the most visible person in any room. She specialized in combat medicine, not because it was the easiest path for a high-ranking graduate. It was not, but because, as she wrote in a career preference document filed during her 2nd year, the most important person on any battlefield is the one who keeps people alive long enough for everything else to matter. She completed her initial training in 1998. She completed Advanced Special Operations Medical Certification in 1999, a program so demanding that the attrition rate across her cohort was 61%. She did not attrit. She completed the program with evaluations that her supervising officers described in language that military assessment forms rarely accommodate. Extraordinary, unprecedented, unlike anything previously observed in this pipeline. She deployed to Iraq for the first time in 2002, then again in 2003. Her service records from both deployments are, in the surviving fragments, almost entirely redacted black bars covering the specific details of where she went, what she did, who she treated, and what she witnessed. What remains visible are the administrative notations: dates of deployment, dates of return, physical evaluation results that consistently showed a person operating at peak condition, and a series of commendation recommendations that appear to have been filed and then quietly withdrawn before they could be processed. Someone kept pulling her name back from the light. On March 14, 2004, the official record of Lieutenant Commander Ilara Voss ends with 4 words typed in the standard administrative font of a Department of Defense casualty notification. Killed in action, FALLUGH. A casualty report was generated. A notification team was dispatched to Billings, Montana. 2 officers in dress uniforms knocked on the door of a house heated by a wood stove and told a former Marine and a night shift nurse that their daughter had died serving her country. A flag was folded at a ceremony attended by fellow officers who had served with her, or believed they had. She was buried in official record in a military cemetery outside Billings. The grave exists. The body in it does not belong to Ilara Voss. The program that took her was called Wraith. It did not have a headquarters. It did not have a commanding officer in any traditional sense. It had an architect, a name that appears in exactly one surviving document as a set of initials, RMW, attached to a budget authorization request filed through a defense appropriations channel so obscure that the congressional staffer who processed it later told investigators he had assumed it was a clerical error and almost deleted it. Wraith was built on a premise that was simultaneously simple and monstrous, that the most valuable asset in special operations is not firepower, not technology, not intelligence in the traditional sense, but proximity. The ability to be present, unnoticed, unquestioned, unremarkable in the spaces closest to the most dangerous missions, to observe, to protect, to intervene at the precise moment when the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure comes down to one person in the right place with the right skills. Wraith operatives were not soldiers in any conventional definition. They were something the program's internal documents described, with a clinical detachment that reads today as genuinely chilling, as persistent proximity assets. They were selected from across the military's special operations medical community based on a profile so specific that, in the program's entire operational history, fewer than 19 people ever met it. Ilara Voss met every criterion. The selection process required her to die first. The death was constructed with extraordinary care, a false casualty event in Fallujah, timed to coincide with a period of genuine heavy casualties that provided natural cover, documented with the full administrative machinery of the Department of Defense acting in complete sincerity, because only 4 people in the entire department knew the documentation was fiction. Her parents were told. Her colleagues were told. Her Naval Academy classmates received the notification. Everyone grieved a woman who was, at the moment of their grieving, undergoing surgical alteration of minor identifying features, biometric re-enrollment under a new identity, and the first of what would become many thorough briefings on a life she had never lived but would now inhabit completely. She was given a new name, then another, then another. Sarah Cole was the 9th. She had been running for 5 years by the time the helicopters didn't land in Kunar province in November 2009. 9 deployments under false identities. Iraq, Syria, the Horn of Africa, places that don't appear on any operational map available to the public and several that don't appear on any map at all. She had saved lives in all of them, quietly, completely, without credit, without record, without anyone ever knowing her real name. The Wraith program's internal performance assessments, fragments of which exist in a congressional archive under a filing classification so dense that they were not discovered until 2019, referred to her only by her asset designation, W7. W7's operational record, in the sanitized language of program documentation, cited her as having been directly responsible for the preservation of an estimated 340 Allied personnel across 9 operational deployments prior to Iron Shroud. 340 lives, 9 deployments, 5 years. None of it on record, none of it acknowledged, none of it known to the people she had saved, who went home to their families, and their lives carrying the extraordinary gift of continued existence without ever knowing the name of the person who had given it to them. She had accepted this. She had agreed to it in a room somewhere in 2004, with full understanding of what it meant, that her service would be total and her recognition would be nothing, that she would spend whatever years the work required her to spend as a ghost wearing borrowed names, saving lives that the system would never connect to her, until the day the work was finished or the day she was. On a frozen ridge in eastern Afghanistan in November 2009, it had appeared that the day was the same. It was not. And when Staff Sergeant Erin Phillips pressed her finger to a scanner in the gray pre-dawn light, and the system returned a name that had been dead for 5 years, the name Alara Voss surfacing from beneath layers of classification like something rising from very deep water, the architecture of invisibility that had protected her, defined her, and consumed her for half a decade began, quietly and irreversibly, to crack. The black helicopter arrived before the sun finished rising. There was no radio call preceding it, no coordination with the recovery team on the ground, no announcement of any kind. It simply appeared over the southern ridgeline, a ghost aircraft running without markings, without unit designation, without any of the visual identifiers that military aviation protocol requires, and descended toward the valley floor with the particular purposefulness of something that has been waiting nearby for a specific signal and has now received it. Staff Sergeant Erin Phillips watched it come down and understood, with the instinctive clarity of a soldier who has learned to read the language of institutional power, that the locked screen on his field tablet had sent a notification to someone very far away who had been waiting a very long time for exactly this kind of alert. 2 men stepped out before the rotors had fully settled. Civilian clothing, no insignia, no introduction. The older of the 2, gray-haired, unhurried, with the particular stillness of someone who has spent decades in rooms where decisions are made, and has long since stopped being surprised by anything those decisions require, walked directly to where Alara Voss lay on the litter, and looked at her for a moment with an expression that Phillips later described as the way a person looks at something they thought they had lost and are not entirely sure how to feel about finding. He did not touch her, he did not speak to her. He turned to Phillips and held out his hand. "The tablet," he said. It was not a request. Phillips handed it over. The man took it, looked at the locked screen, pressed his thumb to a secondary authentication point that Phillips had not known existed on standard-issue field tablets, and watched the screen unlock and display a menu that Phillips, standing close enough to see, did not recognize from any system he had ever been trained on. The man navigated to something, pressed twice, and handed the tablet back. The biometric record was gone, not flagged, not restricted, gone as if the scan had never been run, as if the name had never surfaced, as if the 47 seconds between the result appearing and the screen locking had been reached into and quietly removed from the fabric of recorded events. "You're going to want to prep her for transport," the man said to Phillips, already turning away. "She needs a surgical facility," Phillips said. "The torso wounds she needs." "She'll have everything she needs," the man said without turning back. They loaded her onto the helicopter with a speed and competence that told Phillips the 2 men had done this before, the movement of people who are not learning a procedure but executing one they have rehearsed. Within 6 minutes of landing, the helicopter was back in the air. Within 8 minutes, it had crossed the ridgeline and disappeared as completely as if it had never existed. Phillips stood in the valley and watched the empty sky for a long time. The debriefing of the recovery team happened at Bagram Air Base, in 4 separate rooms, simultaneously, a structural choice that ensured the 4 men could not compare notes before the process began. The officers who conducted it were polite, thorough, and precise in a way that communicated, without ever stating directly, that the precision was not about gathering information, but about calibrating what information would be allowed to leave the room. Phillips was asked, in careful sequence, to describe everything he had observed from the moment the team departed until the moment it returned. He answered accurately and completely. When he reached the point in his account where the field tablet had returned a result before locking, the debriefing officer's pen stopped moving. "What did the screen display before it locked?" the officer asked. "A name," Phillips said. "What name?" Phillips looked at the officer. He had been in the military for 12 years. He understood the architecture of what was happening in this room, the careful, procedural dismantling of a witness account, brick by brick, until what remained was a version of events that the institution could live with comfortably. He also understood that he had 4 minutes of sitting on a ridge in the Afghan dawn that no debriefing could reach. "The screen locked before I could read it clearly," he said. The officer looked at him for a moment, then wrote something, then moved to the next question. The official communication sent to the SEAL teams of Operation Iron Shroud was distributed within 24 hours of the recovery. It was 4 sentences long, formatted on standard DoD letterhead, signed by a brigadier general whose name appeared on no public roster of active flag officers. It confirmed that the combat medic attached to the operation had been recovered and is receiving appropriate medical care through designated channels. It expressed appreciation for the professionalism demonstrated by all personnel. It reminded every recipient of their security clearance obligations under the relevant statutes. It did not mention a name. It did not mention the Eastern Ridge. It did not mention 44 minutes, or 23 dead Taliban fighters, or the specific and extraordinary nature of what one person had done alone in the dark so that everyone else could live. It was, in its 4 careful sentences, a masterpiece of institutional silence, the kind of document that says everything about what it is hiding by the precise shape of what it leaves out. Master Chief William Greer read it once, folded it carefully, and placed it in the breast pocket of his uniform. Then he sat down at the small desk in his temporary quarters at Bagram and began to write. Not a report, not a formal complaint, not anything that would travel through channels where it could be intercepted, reviewed, and quietly made to disappear. He wrote by hand, in a composition notebook he had bought at a PX in Kandahar 3 weeks earlier, in the small and meticulous handwriting of a man who had grown up being told that if something was worth saying, it was worth saying correctly. He wrote everything, every detail, every conversation, every observation across 72 hours that had given him the growing, unshakable sense that the woman called Sarah Cole was something that no one had briefed him to understand. He wrote about the way she moved. He wrote about the map she drew from memory. He wrote about the expression on her face when she stepped around him and walked toward the ridge. He wrote, "I have served this country for 22 years. I have followed orders I did not fully understand because I trusted the institution that gave them. I am recording this because I no longer trust that the institution will record it accurately on its own, and because what that woman did on that ridge deserves to exist somewhere in language, even if that somewhere is a composition notebook that no one may ever read." He was not the only one writing. A SEAL from Virginia, 26 years old, on his 2nd deployment, a man who had joined the Navy because his older brother had, and who had never expected to find himself changed by the experience in ways he couldn't articulate to anyone who hadn't been there, drove 4 hours one Sunday in January to deliver a sealed envelope to a retired senator he had once worked security detail for during a congressional trip to Kabul. The senator read it that evening. He read it twice. He sat in the study of his home in Northern Virginia for a long time afterward, looking at the fireplace, turning the envelope over in his hands. Then he made 3 phone calls. The first was to a former colleague on the Senate Armed Services Committee. The second was to a retired intelligence officer he had known for 30 years. The third was to his personal attorney. None of those calls were recorded. None of them needed to be. What moved through those conversations, carefully, obliquely, in the language of people who understand that the walls of power have very good hearing, was the beginning of something that institutions like the one that built Wraith are specifically designed to prevent. The beginning of a record that couldn't be deleted. A journalist named Catherine Reyes had spent 11 years covering the quiet tragedies of American special operations. The families who waited, the bodies that came home wrong, the stories that the military preferred to process administratively rather than honestly. She had won 2 awards for work that powerful people had tried to stop, and received 3 separate unofficial requests to change careers, which she had declined with the polite firmness of someone who understands that being asked to stop is confirmation that you are doing the right thing. She received a package on a Tuesday morning in February. No return address. Postmarked from a city in the Midwest that she did not associate with anyone she knew. Inside was a partial field log, pages 7 through 14 of what appeared to be a personal written account, the first 6 pages and everything after page 14 absent. A photograph, blurred to the edge of uselessness, that showed a figure on a ridge at dawn in a landscape she recognized as eastern Afghanistan. And a card, plain white, unlined, with 4 words written on it in handwriting she did not recognize. She was never there. Catherine Reyes set the card down on her desk. She looked at the photograph. She read the partial field log 3 times slowly, with the focused attention of someone assembling a picture from fragments. Then she opened a new document on her computer and began to type the first of what would eventually become 47 interview requests, 23 FOIA filings, and 1 article that a major publication would agree to run, and then, 3 days before publication, quietly declined to print. The silence was holding. But silence, like everything that is maintained by effort rather than truth, was beginning to cost more than it was worth. She woke up in a room with no windows. That was the first thing she registered. Not the pain, which was considerable and present in layers, each layer corresponding to a different wound in a different location on a body that had absorbed more punishment than most people ever ask their bodies to absorb. Not the smell of antiseptic and recycled air. Not the sound of monitoring equipment translating her continued existence into a series of quiet, rhythmic confirmations. Not the presence of a guard outside the door whose footsteps she could hear shifting every few hours with the regularity of a man following a rotation schedule. The first thing she registered was the absence of windows. She had always oriented herself by light, by the quality of it, the angle of it, the particular color that natural light takes on in different geographies at different hours, the blue-gray of Afghan pre-dawn, the flat white of Iraqi midday, the amber thickness of East African late afternoon. Light had been her clock and her compass for 5 years of living in borrowed names in borrowed lives, and its absence now told her, more precisely than any briefing ever could, exactly what kind of place she was in. A place that did not want her to know where she was. She had been in places like this before. The difference was that previously she had entered them voluntarily. The facility was outside Stuttgart, Germany, a fact she deduced not from any information she was given, but from the specific frequency of the aircraft she heard overhead during the first week, the particular composition of the food she was served, and a single unconsidered detail on the part of the guard who changed her IV line on the 3rd day and wore, on his right wrist, a watch that displayed a second time zone set to Eastern Standard Time, 6 hours behind, which meant she was 6 hours ahead of Washington. Western Europe, Almost certainly Germany. Almost certainly a facility adjacent to or within the broader infrastructure of EUCOM, United States European Command. The sprawling military administrative complex outside Stuttgart that was large enough and complex enough to hide a room with no windows and a patient with no official name, without anyone asking inconvenient questions. She spent the first 2 weeks healing and thinking. The thinking was the more important of the two. She had known, from the moment she sat down against that boulder on the eastern ridge, and understood that she was not going to be able to stand back up, that the fingerprints would be run. She had known that the database would return a result. She had known that the result would trigger a protocol that she had been briefed on during her initial Wraith orientation. A protocol designed precisely for the scenario of an asset being recovered in a condition that required medical treatment and therefore identification by personnel without appropriate clearance. What she had not known, what she had not allowed herself to think about in the 5 years of borrowed names and borrowed lives, was what happened after the protocol. She knew now. After the protocol, there was a room with no windows. After the room with no windows, there was a conversation. It came on the 19th day, delivered by a man she had never seen before, not the gray-haired man from the helicopter, not anyone from her original Wraith orientation, but someone new. Someone who sat down across from her with the measured composure of a person about to make a business proposition, and who had the particular quality of stillness that she associated with people who have made many such propositions, and have learned that the stillness communicates more effectively than any words. He told her without preliminary that she had 3 options. The first option was continuation, a new name, new documentation, a period of recovery followed by reassignment, not necessarily to Wraith, which was, he noted without elaboration, undergoing a structural review, but to a role that would make use of her particular skills in a context that he was not yet at liberty to specify. The second option was separation, full administrative discharge from any connection to any program, classified or otherwise, relocation assistance, a constructed civilian identity of sufficient depth and quality to sustain a normal life, medical support through a private channel for as long as she required it, and a signed acknowledgement, witnessed and filed in a location she would never have access to, confirming that she understood the terms of her silence and had accepted them voluntarily. He paused before the third option. The third option, he said, is the one I would strongly encourage you not to choose. She looked at him for a long time. I'll take the second, she said. Something moved across his face, too quickly to identify, gone before it could be named. Relief, possibly, or its close cousin, the particular relaxation of a man who came prepared for a harder conversation and has been spared it. He nodded once, set a folder on the table between them. There are some documents that will need your signature, he said. She looked at the folder without touching it. I want something first, she said. What she asked for was small enough, in the architecture of what the institution owed her, to be almost insulting. She did not ask for recognition. She did not ask for the record to be corrected, for the citations to be reinstated, for the 340 lives she had saved before Iron Shroud to be attached to her real name in any document that anyone would ever read. She asked to go home. Not permanently, not visibly. She asked for 48 hours escorted, monitored, whatever conditions they required in Billings, Montana. She asked to stand in a specific place for a specific reason that she did not explain to the man across the table, and she asked that this one thing be given to her before she signed anything or became anyone new. The man considered this for a moment. Then he said yes. She stood at the grave for a long time. The stone bore her name, the real one, the first one, and the dates that the military had assigned to a life that had not ended when they said it had. It was a real grave, in a real cemetery, on a hillside outside Billings where the wind came down from the mountains in the late afternoon, with the particular insistence of Montana wind, which does not ask permission and does not apologize. Her parents did not know she was there. The terms of the visit made that impossible, and she had accepted the terms because the alternative was not coming at all, and not coming at all was the one thing she could not do. She stood at the stone and she did not cry, not because she felt nothing, but because she had spent 5 years training herself to process everything in silence. And some disciplines, once fully learned, cannot be entirely unlearned even when the reason for them is standing in a Montana cemetery in the late afternoon. She stayed for 22 minutes. Then she turned and walked back to the car where the 2 escorts waited, and she did not look back. She signed the documents. She became someone new. The Wraith program was formally dissolved in 2011. A single footnote in a partially declassified congressional oversight report describing it as a specialized support initiative that has been concluded following a comprehensive operational review. No names, no numbers, no accounting of what the program had asked of the people who served in it, or what those people had given in exchange for the particular honor of being erased. The 480 men of Operation Iron Shroud went home. They dispersed back into the ordinary world, to families, to subsequent deployments, to the difficult and imperfect work of rebuilding a civilian self from the materials that combat leaves behind. Some of them left the military quietly in the years that followed, departing with full honors and empty explanations that satisfied no one who knew them well. Some struggled in ways they couldn't name to people who hadn't been there. Some sat at kitchen tables in the early morning and looked at nothing and waited for the feeling to pass. All of them remembered the ridge. In the winter of 2013, 4 years after Iron Shroud, 2 years after Wraith was dissolved, in the particular silence that follows the official conclusion of things that were never officially begun, a stone appeared in a small cemetery outside Billings, Montana. It was not placed by the Department of Defense. There is no record of its installation in any cemetery registry. No funeral home processed the order. No stone mason in the surrounding county acknowledged cutting it, though the workmanship was clean and precise and spoke of someone who understood that some things deserve to be done carefully. The stone bore her name, the real one. Below the name, no dates, no rank, no unit designation, no language borrowed from the official vocabulary of military honor, no beloved, no faithful, no in service to her country. Just the name, and below it, mounted on a small wooden bracket that someone had attached with the kind of careful hardware that is meant to last through seasons, a plaque. The plaque read, "She was there, we know, we remember." No signature, no unit identification, nothing that could be traced or claimed or administratively processed. Just the words and the wind coming down from the mountains, and the knowledge, held privately, permanently, in the memory of 480 men who had walked out of a valley in eastern Afghanistan, because one woman had decided that their lives were worth more than her name, that some debts cannot be classified, cannot be redacted, cannot be made to disappear by any banner on any screen in any system that any institution has ever built. She had given everything she had. They had given her the only thing left that was theirs to give. The memory, the stone, the words, and the absolute, unbreakable certainty that whatever the record said, whatever the file showed, whatever the system had decided to remember or forget, on a ridge in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan, in the cold dark of a November night in 2009, she had been there. She had been there. And because she had been there, every single one of them was still here. The end.